Hello, my name is Elvis Wagner, and I am an Associate Professor of TESOL at the College of Education at Temple University. And today I'm going to be talking about real-world listening for international teaching assistants. So basically, I'm going to give you a quick overview. I'm going to talk about the fact that speaking and listening are important for successful ITAs. I'm going to talk about the characteristics of real-world spoken English, what we need to teach our ITAs to do, and then I'm going to talk about how we teach the ITAs to be able to understand this real-world spoken English. And then I'm going to end quickly with a sort of a postscript talking about tests that are used for ITA screening purposes. All right, so as you all obviously know, universities, ITA programs, require ITAs to demonstrate that they have an adequate level of English ability to be able to be successful teachers. Okay, that makes sense. And usually the way that's operationalized, the way that's put into practice is through speaking scores. Okay, they don't, universities or ITA programs don't require usually the ITAs to submit their writing scores or reading scores. And that makes sense, right? Because so many, especially foreign language learners, often are very proficient at reading and writing, and their oral ability skills might lag. So it makes sense just to focus on the oral ability. But oral ability isn't just speaking, even though that's often what is required, is the speaking scores. Because obviously, in order to be a successful instructor at a North American university, English medium university, the instructor needs to be able to speak English. That's obvious. But they also need to be able to understand spoken English. They need to be able to listen in English as well. Okay, so there's a bit of a mismatch between the requirements and that are tested, and then what the ITA actually has to be able to do. Okay, and in fact, two very important studies, Myers and Plackens from '94 and '97, they found undergraduates that had ITAs in their class, when they expressed frustration at ITA's perceived inability or lack of proficiency in English, what they were most frustrated by was the ITA's inability or perceived inability to understand student questions. Okay, so speaking obviously is important, but students really feel the instructors need to be able to understand spoken English. So obviously, speaking and listening scores should be used for placement purposes. You know, from a theoretical perspective, it's obvious, okay? Teaching requires speaking and listening. So using speaking and listening scores are better or construct valid than using speaking scores alone. So in 2016, I did a study, a TOEFL grants funded study, looking at TOEFL scores and how that predicted teaching competence by ITAs. And basically what I found was that speaking scores did not predict ITA teaching performance. And the ITA teaching performance was measured as by student evaluation, end of semester student evaluation of their teachers, but also independent observers' evaluation of the teaching competence of the ITAs. And not entirely surprising, speaking scores weren't a significant predictor of ITA teaching competence, but TOEFL listening scores were significant predictors. So they weren't, they didn't predict a lot of the teaching competence, which you wouldn't expect it to necessarily, but basically what it came down to was that listening scores were better predictors of ultimate ITA teaching performance than those ITA's speaking scores. So there's a lot of, theoretically it totally makes sense, and there's some empirical evidence as well that listening is a really important component of teaching, and that it should be included when you're trying to measure ITA's language proficiency. What's interesting about it, though, is that even though those listening scores are better predictors of teaching competence than speaking scores, the way listening is measured on these tests, the TOEFL, for example, is problematic, okay? Because the construct of listening that is used that is assessed on the TOEFL IBT is different from the construct applicable to most ITAs, okay? So the TOEFL only measures one-way listening, while ITAs are expected to be able to do interactive speaking and listening, that interpersonal communication, of where listening is a really important part of that. That's not measured in the, it's not assessed in the TOEFL, and yet that's something ITAs are required to do. Another problem with it is the TOEFL uses audio-only texts, while, in the classroom, ITAs can see the speaker, they can use that nonverbal information that the speaker transmits. So again, there's a bit of a mismatch between what is measured on the TOEFL listening and what ITAs actually have to do in the classroom. But perhaps the biggest problem with the way TOEFL and other tests measure listening is the types of spoken text they use on those on the tests. Okay, so TOEFL, other tests, and also you think about foreign language classrooms, foreign language textbooks, things like that. They create spoken text that they use for listening practice and listening assessments. So they write them out and they revise them, and then they edit them, and then they polish them, and then they're read aloud, often by professional voice actors. And so they enunciate very clearly and they speak slowly. And so that type of spoken language with those textbook texts is very different from the unplanned spoken discourse that ITAs are going to hear in the classroom. Okay, so look at this comparison of real world spoken language, what it prototypically includes, and then the type of spoken language in textbook text. So rapid speech versus much slower speech, a lot of connected speech versus clearly enunciated speech. Speech that is, it has non-linear organizational patterns, discourse patterns, as opposed to very straightforward linear organizational patterns. Real world spoken language has a lot of hesitation phenomena, has a lot of pauses, has a lot of false starts, has a lot of repetitions, and those hesitation phenomena often don't occur in textbook texts. There's a lot of slang and informal language, oral grammatical norms in real world spoken language, and not in textbook texts. Real world spoken English often has many different accent varieties, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, from different regions of the United States and the world. L2 accented English. Textbook texts, in contrast, almost always use speakers with standard English. Real world spoken language has these things, these listener response features like interruptions and latches and back channels, and those rarely occur in textbook texts. Okay, so that's a real problem. So another way to think about it, what do undergrads do? Undergraduate students in the United States and the university, they speak quickly, they have lots of connected speech, and they mumble. They often are speaking non-coherently, non-organized. They often have lots of filled pauses and false starts and repetitions and lots of slang and informal language. They have oral grammatical norms. They have many different kinds of accents. So this is what ITAs are expected to be able to understand, yet those tests that we use for ITA placement often don't include these characteristics of real world spoken language. And that's a real problem. We're not getting a very good measure of the types of listening that ITAs are going to have to do in the classroom. So that's what, so I'll give you an example, filled pauses. This is a concrete example, a really nice study done by Nat Carney. Okay, so we know filled pauses, things like, like these are ubiquitous in spoken language. They happen all the time. We're unaware of just how common, how prevalent they are, but they happen all the time. We don't notice them because we can just ignore them. We process them automatically. We don't even notice them. L2 learners, though, often have problems with them because they don't realize that they are filled pauses. They're trying to assign semantic meaning to them, and they can't because they don't have semantic meaning, and then comprehension suffers. So Carney did this study. It was this is from his dissertation in 2018, and he also published it in TESOL Quarterly in 2020. We had 20 intermediate and advanced L2 listeners of English. They were Japanese learners. And he had them do an L2 repetition task. So they had to listen to an oral text and then repeat orally what they'd heard. So here's what they heard. I had a lot of trouble. Okay, so with that filled pause in there. I had a lot of trouble. But these L2 listeners, this is what they reported hearing. I had a lot of trouble. I think it's amazing, 20 out of 20, every single one of those intermediate to advanced EFL learners decoded that sentence incorrectly because they didn't know that it was a filled pause. They tried to assign a semantic meaning to it. So instead of they said am, even though they knew it didn't make sense, some of them explicitly said, had a lot of trouble is ungrammatical. So there's no way the person said that, but that's what I heard. Okay, so just a really concrete example of how things like filled pauses, one of these real characteristics of unplanned spoken language, real world spoken language, can cause real difficulties for L2 listeners, basically because they are unaware that these things happen. Okay, and so if nothing else, this is what I think we need to do when we're teaching our ITAs, is that many L2 learners, especially foreign learners, foreign language learners who have learned English in a foreign language context, are unaware of the characteristics of real world spoken language. So part of our job as L2 teachers is to help make the learners aware of these characteristics. Let them know that these sort of things happen in real world spoken language, and make them aware of it, and then notice it in subsequent input. And that can really help listeners, L2 listeners' ability to understand these types of spoken language. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is we need to teach real world listening to ITAs. We need to teach the types of listening that they're going to do in their classroom. Okay, and so some ways we do this, provide lots and lots of meaningful listening practice. Okay, so I think oftentimes there's a lot of focus on the speaking component in ITA programs, perhaps not enough on listening. So we need to really prioritize that. We also need to obviously teach interpretive one-way listening, but we also need to teach listening as part of interpersonal communication, interactive speaking and listening, because that's probably even more important for the ITA context. We should use audio-visual input when we're teaching listening to ITAs, because they're going to be able to see the listener, the speaker in the classroom context. That's the type of listening that includes that audio-visual, that nonverbal information. So that's how we should teach it. We should also provide them with lots of spoken input with many different varieties of the language, not just the standard variety. They often can understand the standard variety. It's the non-standard varieties, the more regional accents, the more different types of social accents, L2 accented English. These are all types of English they're going to need to be able to understand. So we need to provide lots of meaningful practice and draw their attention, make them aware of these different types of spoken language. And then I think most importantly, we need to use a lot of authentic real world spoken text in the classroom. Okay, use these texts and then create tasks that make the listeners aware of the characteristics of unplanned spoken language. That's perhaps the most important thing we can do. So things that we can, very concrete things, we can teach filled pauses, make listeners, the ITA listeners aware that filled pauses exist, what they sound like. So a couple of my former doc students I wrote a series of pedagogical papers in TESOL connections. Okay, so we actually created these lessons, so for example, about how to teach filled pauses. And here is the URL for the TESOL Connections article. And it gives very concrete ideas about how to teach filled pauses. It has, a link to an audio text that they can listen to, and it has a lot of filled pauses. And then there are lesson plans and activities related to that particular text, really promoting this idea of making listeners aware of filled pauses in spoken English. We can teach connected speech, make them aware that connected speech is ubiquitous. It happens all the time in real world spoken language. So here's another study from another pedagogical article from TESOL Connections, where has concrete examples about how to do that and examples of audio text that you can use and activities associated with that. And also teaching things like the listener response features like back channels. So another article that we have about teaching back channels. I really like these three articles. It has, you can literally take these lessons and then use them in your classroom. It has a lot of the information. So I really recommend, here are concrete ways to teach real world listening to ITAs. Okay, so I'm just about finished, but one last thing I want to talk about standardized tests, okay, for using them for ITA placement purposes. So again, a lot of ITA programs use standardized English proficiency tests for ITA placement, often use the TOEFL, IBT, and the IELTS. These are really highly respected, really common English proficiency tests, and they're very good tests, okay? They're very good for what they were designed for. And they were designed to assess test takers' ability to use English at the university level as a student. Okay, so again, I know a lot about these tests. I think they're very good tests for university admissions purposes. They were not designed, however, to assess L2 learners' ability, test takers' ability to teach classes at the university level in the English medium university. Okay, so ITA programs that use these tests are using them not what they were designed for. And so from a testing perspective, that's problematic. From a validity perspective, that's really problematic. So you need to make a validation argument if you're going to use this test for something that they weren't initially created for. Fulcher and Davidson use this idea of test retrofit. So you think of a building architecture where a building is retrofitted for a different use than what it was originally developed for. And that can be done, right? But it's hard. It takes a lot of work. It's a heavy lifting, costs a lot of money. And then when you finish, it still might not be great for this other purpose than what it was originally designed for. And the same goes for tests. And I make the argument that if you were going to use a test for something that it was not really designed for and that there isn't a validity argument for, you're going to have a lot of empirical evidence supporting its use for different things. So you need TOEFL and IELTS need a lot of empirical evidence supporting a validity argument that they can be used for ITA screening purposes. And frankly, they don't have a lot of that. Okay, TOEFL IBT, there's some empirical research, not a lot. My study provided some empirical support for this idea, but it was very limited, and it really showed a lot of the limitations of the TOEFL IBT for ITA screening purposes. The IELTS, honestly, I don't know. I don't know how much research there is. I don't think there's a whole lot, but people are using it for ITA screening purposes, and it's problematic. And then there's the Duolingo English test, the DET. Okay, so I know a lot about the DET. I've done a couple of test reviews in Language Assessment Quarterly, one in 2015, one in 2020, looking at the DET for university admissions purposes. And I'm really critical of the use of the DET for university admissions purposes for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into. You can read the review if you want. But I'm even more critical of using the DET for ITA placement, okay? As far as I know, and I'm pretty confident that this is the case, there is absolutely zero empirical evidence, empirical data supporting the use of the DET for ITA placement purposes. There's not a theoretical argument for it. There's no empirical research for it. And frankly, it's inappropriate and perhaps unethical to be using DET scores for ITA placement purposes. So you shouldn't. Okay, that is the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to some question and answers. Thanks.